to have your pictures showing, then feel free to stop your video and just join us with sound. That's entirely up to yourselves, but we're giving you that advance warning. I'd like to welcome you all to the evening. The session is coming at a difficult time for all of us, I think. We've had a very harrowing 2020 and 2021 so far. The pandemic's affected not only jobs and livelihoods, but also social life, and it's exacerbated and highlighted problems which were already there. Some of you were listed in the invitation. Some of those were listed in the invitation sent to the parties to choose a candidate to appear before you this evening. The issues of poverty, the use of food banks, homelessness, reduced opportunities for young people, support for those in abusive relationships, support for migrants, in particular those with no access to public funds, and the effects on communities as a whole. The idea of universal basic income, or UBI as it's abbreviated, as a means of beginning to tackle such problems has gained increasing interest in recent years, with a network of UBI labs spread over England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, as well as in countries abroad. UBI would provide everyone in the country with a regular income guarantee, paid weekly or monthly, regardless of their background or of their economic circumstances, and it would provide that as a right. Supporters see it as part of a plan to deal with the problems mentioned already. There are discussions and disagreements about how it should be paid for, how much it should be, and what effect it would have on employment, the cost of living, and other existing benefits. Our recently formed group, Glasgow UBI Conversation, consists of people who want to discuss the proposal amongst ourselves and with others. That's what a conversation is about. We want the proposal discussed more widely, and we want to know what those people who may be part of the process of making decisions about resolving the problems I've highlighted, to find out what they think of it, whether universal basic income is part of that economic recovery plan, and if not, how they aim to improve things for people like those mentioned already. That's what this evening's hustings-style event's about. It lets you, members of the audience, hear what the people before you, all candidates in Glasgow and their parties, feel about universal basic income as a means of making things better. I'd like to introduce our chair for the evening, who will conduct the rest of the evening. He's Professor Mike Danson from Heriot-Watt University, an expert on universal basic income and chair of BINS, Basic Income Network Scotland. So you can be sure that at least one person here knows all about UBI. He will introduce our 6 panelists, whom I very much thank for participating this evening near the start of what for them will be a very, very busy 4 weeks of electioneering. Thank you all. Over to you, Mike. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bob. Okay, so as said, my name is Mike Danson. I'm chairing the hustings this evening, as well as being chair of Basic Income Network Scotland. I'm also chairing the World Congress on Basic Income, which is coming to Glasgow this August. So that's quite a coup for us. For the first time ever, it will be online and it will be free, which means anybody in the world interest in basic income can come along and discuss it as a concept, as a way of addressing poverty around the world and so forth. So we're very happy to have that. And we'll put up in the chat how you can get involved and participate and so on. Where are we? Yep. So we're absolutely delighted that we have representatives from 6 parties speaking tonight. We have Adi Ibanu from the Scottish Conservative Party. I have to look at my notes. Carol Ford, Scottish Liberal Democrats. Patrick Harvey, don't think he's here yet. Scottish Green Party. Pauline McNeill, Scottish Labour. Rosa Sally from Scottish National Party. And finally, Brian Smith, Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition. They're going to speak in that order, which is alphabetical order. We thought it was the fairest way to do it. They're going to speak for 3 minutes each, and I'll be timing them. And they're politicians, so they know how to keep to time. We'll then open for question and answer. So if you get any questions, could you put them in the chat, and they'll be passed on to me. I will then invite individuals, if they so wish, to present the question. By all means, introduce yourselves, but don't be making political statements, or we'll mute you. So we'll put questions, and then we'll go around the panel for answers. And we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. And we aim to finish about 10 to 9, and then Susan will come back in and wrap the evening off. We're recording on Facebook, so if you don't want to be seen, then if you turn off your video, we'll keep you muted unless you're asking questions. When the people are speaking, when people are speaking, you might want to go to the top right-hand corner of your screen, click on that little icon and go to speaker view. Then you get the main speaker filling up. Gallery view allows you to see far more faces. If you're tweeting, then it's hashtag Glasgow UBI conversation. I just noticed in the chat that Patrick Harvey's unfortunately not able to attend, and speaking on behalf of the Scottish Green Party's Kim Long. You were down there on the bottom left of my screen. Okay, I'll fit you in when Patrick would have spoken, just to keep the order. And unless there's if you've got any questions, you can put it in the chat. So particularly technical questions, and we'll try and get to them. Otherwise, I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Adi Ibanu, who will be speaking on behalf of the Scottish Conservative Party.
Thanks, Mike, and good evening to everyone as well. It's a privilege to be with everyone tonight. Representing the Conservative Party tonight to speak on UBI, as Mike has said himself. I think the first thing to say, and it's quite important that I allude to this point, is that I very much sympathize with your objective in terms of, helping people to live much more comfortable life and alleviating poverty. That's something that I very much sympathize with. But I don't think UBI is the right approach to solving this problem. It's a very complex problem, poverty in our society. And there's a couple of reasons why I don't agree with UBI. I think one thing that I'll say, it's not targeted. Also amongst proponents of UBI themselves, there is no consensus in terms of the operational delivery mechanism for UBI and the delivery model. So that's something which is quite concerning. And we've had pilot studies of UBI. So, for example, the Finnish government did a pilot for UBI itself. I think that's 2017, and found out that it actually didn't help people into employment and had to stop it. And so when you see that level of evidence with a government state-sponsored pilot in UBI coming up with that level, with that report, then we need to think twice. The Finnish government did decide that the kind of welfare system we've got in United Kingdom is perhaps a much more better way than UBI itself. And even the Scottish government themselves did a pilot on UBI in 4 local authorities, backed by, I think, £250,000 of public money in Edinburgh City Council, Glasgow City Council, Fife and North Ayrshire Council as well. And the CBI did a feasibility study based on what the Scottish government had done, and basically saying it wasn't feasible to carry on with UBI itself. So that's 2 governments, doing pilot studies into UBI and not coming up with any sort of evidence-based concrete outcomes in terms of the ability of UBI to have a transformative effect. So, based on this, I do not think it's the right approach, but like I say, it's a very laudable initiative in terms of the objective. I think the chair did make mention of a couple of things in his opening remarks when he spoke about skills development. I work in further education, and I think for me, one thing we really should be doing in terms of long-term strategic goals to actually alleviate people out of poverty is looking at skills development. I think we perhaps rather focus on that much more than UBI. I'm not saying that there are no that there is no poverty in society, far from it. Like that was one of the very first things I say. But skills development is a much more long-term sustainable model, helping people into highly paid jobs. I think that's how we break people out of the cycle of poverty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good start. Okay. Second, Carol Ford from the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Carol.
There are many reasons why people may find themselves living below the poverty line. Delays in universal credit, low paid, insecure work, illness, disability, caring responsibilities. And we know that child poverty levels in particular were rising in Scotland before the pandemic. With further job losses looming, particularly for women, poverty levels are set to increase across the board. And the impacts of living in poverty are well known. The deterioration in mental health, which can become a vicious downward spiral, the physical health problems associated with poor diet and poor living conditions, the educational attainment gap, which limits opportunities for life, dependence on drugs and alcohol, which can lead to self-harm and homelessness. Scotland, and Glasgow in particular, has some of the most depressing statistics on poverty, health and education in Europe. I'm a native of Glasgow. My parents grew up in the Gorbals and Possil in the 1930s, and they would find it hard to believe that so little progress has been made to prevent the blight of poverty, which affects so many people's lives. There are many things we can do now to alleviate the situation: doubling the child poverty payment, increasing carers' allowances, insisting on the living wage being paid to employees, doubling the number of mental health counsellors, retrofitting houses to alleviate fuel poverty. But these are strategies, short-term strategies to alleviate particular problems. And we actually need more fundamental structural change to prevent people falling into poverty in the first place, to prevent the need for such a plethora of individual strategies to try and mitigate the effects. We need to fix the problem at source, which is simply a lack of money. And we need to give people the dignity to choose how to live their lives, not oblige them to seek support for individual problems as they arise. And that is why the Liberal Democrats support the principle of UBI, and we support the piloting of different approaches, because we need to actually get this right. We have the example of universal credit in front of us. The principle of universal credit is a no-brainer. Replace a myriad of different benefits, complicated for the applicant and complicated to deliver, replace it with one simple payment. But look how that has turned out in practice. So we have to put the time and effort in to getting UBI right. Nationally, the Liberal Democrats have had a working group looking at this for months, and we are totally committed to supporting a UBI programme which will provide that universal safety net, which will prevent all groups, individuals, families, students, pensioners, stop them falling into poverty. And we look forward as a party to working with other parties to try and get this done.
Sorry, problem with my mouse. Thank you very much, Carol. Next is Kim Long, who's speaking on behalf of the Scottish Green Party, and for any latecomers, she's replacing Patrick Harvey. Thank you, Kim.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks very much for having us this evening. Hi, everyone. My name's Kim Long. I'm from Glasgow, and I'm second on the Glasgow list behind Patrick Harvey, co-leader of the Scottish Green Party. I was the first ever Scottish Greens local councillor elected in the northeast of the city, and I'm running to break new ground again and become our next Green MSP. Before I was elected in Glasgow, I was a community worker and an unpaid carer, and I ran for election in the first place because I was furious about inequality in our city. And now, of course, the pandemic has made inequality and poverty even worse. At the same time, the science is clear that we've got just 9 years to tackle the climate emergency. And we know that climate will impact our city unequally because poverty and ill health makes you more affected by air pollution. Extreme weather affects disabled people and elderly people most, and people without access to cars are more reliant on public transport that we know is crap, it's really expensive, and we've already seen it impacted by flooding. So as we emerge from the pandemic, this is our time to do things differently, to build a fairer and greener Scotland, and the Scottish Greens have a plan for a green recovery from the pandemic. Since our foundation more than 30 years ago, the Scottish Greens have been consistent advocates of a UBI in Parliament and in city councils. In Glasgow, for example, my colleague, Councillor Alan Young, has been instrumental in Glasgow's involvement in the local authority feasibility study work. Scottish Greens believe everybody has the right of a good income to live on, regardless of your individual circumstances. In our manifesto, there will be a commitment to negotiate with the UK government for the powers to introduce a UBI pilot on the model proposed by that feasibility study. And if those powers are refused, we want to fund smaller scale, more limited pilots that don't require the UK government to play ball. And we're also going to examine the feasibility of a Scottish minimum income. So establishing a minimum income standard and use the social security powers that we do to increase the incomes of anyone living below this. Basic income is the single most transformational policy that I can think of. Poverty is shameful, not for those experiencing it, but upon those in power who continue to let it happen. Universal basic income would virtually eliminate poverty, and that in itself is a priceless outcome that justifies its creation. And as well as hugely transforming income inequality through, though, UBI would be transformational in terms of gender justice, racial justice, justice for disabled people. I want to talk about what it means for women and people in the immigration system and for carers. So I really hope we can get to those points in questions. I don't believe we should have to spend so much time mitigating the utter depravity of the UK government's welfare system or the hostile environment, but the fact remains that we do. Glasgow spends, the city council and the grassroots sector and the third sector, we are just about holding people's heads above water, and it's taken everything we've got, and it would be a lot more effective to have an income floor that nobody falls through. The pandemic gives us the biggest opportunity in generations to say enough. Let's not go back to something that was clearly designed to benefit just a few rich white men and let everybody else suffer. We need to rebuild as a fairer, greener Scotland. That's why you should vote like our future depends on it, and on May the 6th, vote Scottish Greens.
Thank you very much. Okay, within 3 minutes. Good. Okay, next. Pauline McNeill of Scottish Labour. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and good evening, everyone. It's really nice to be at such a large hustings. I think it's the largest one I've been at so far. Basic Income Earth Network traced the idea of a basic income as far back as the 16th century, quoting Thomas Mure's Utopia, who said, instead of inflicting these horrible punishments, it would be far more to the point to provide everyone with some means of livelihood so that nobody's under the frightful necessity of becoming first a thief and then a corpse. I'm sure you knew what we meant by that. I really look forward to this discussion tonight, Mike, and I hope it is going to be a discussion, because I think, as Carol Ford said, I think it's important to have a proper cross-party discussion and see where the consensus lies. But I'm sure we all agree that we are coming through the worst time in our recent history. higher levels of poverty, domestic violence, higher levels of serious mental health. It's shone a light on inequality and hardship like never before. So it's quite clear to me that we need to have some structural change. I should have said that I'm Scottish Labour's candidate in Glasgow Shettleston and I'm #1 on the Glasgow list. I speak for Labour on housing and communities, and poverty has been a big feature of the work that I've done over the last 5 years. So we don't yet have a full analysis of the gaps in help and support that our citizens need in order to live their daily lives. And we know that 360,000 people who were on furlough still had a cut in their pay. Many lost their jobs. And it's not their fault, and we should remember this. No one should face this alone because the pandemic did not discriminate and was random in the way that it affected people. So it's really important that we have an analysis going forward about how people were affected and what we should do in order to put our society back together again. I believe a future Holyrood government must singularly focus on the right of every young person to get a start in life, and every business gets a chance to rebuild, and every single person gets the chance that they deserve in order to rebuild their lives, to bridge the gap of financial support by using state intervention where that's necessary. Could be short term, could be long term. One example, I mean, the isolation grant, which is really something that poor people have relied on because so many people don't have sick pay, don't have the employment rights that they deserve, another area worthy of discussion. In fact, Scottish Labour supported the Scottish Greens motion in the Parliament where we both agreed that the isolation grant should have been universal. Everyone who was expected to isolate in order to keep everyone else safe should have had a full payment. And you can see the figures for yourself. The success rates in the isolation grant are extremely poor, and in Glasgow, 53% of applications were rejected. Many renters face eviction, and at least we did work together as a parliament to make sure that people were not evicted from their homes. So much more work to be done because housing is an indicator of people's poverty. I took my fair rent bill. I see Jane Kemp's on the call from Commonweal, who supported me all the way through. There's got to be a focus on high rents. There's got to be state intervention, in Scottish Labour's opinion and in my opinion, to make sure that people can afford to pay their rent. I don't think we've really begun to understand the impact of it. And most agencies I talk to tell me on the ground that sadly we expect a tsunami in child poverty. So we need a big policy to intervene in this. Food justice and food security is a big issue. Scottish Labour has no firm policy on a universal basic income, but our leader in Asarwar has said he's very keen to explore the idea, and leader of North Ayrshire Council, Joe Cullinan, has also said he's keen to run a pilot in his own area.
Pauline, you're a minute over. Thanks very much. Thank you. Okay, plenty of time for you all to talk when the questions come in. Next, we have Rosa Salih of the Scottish National Party.
Hello, hi everyone. My name is Rosa Salih. I'm a campaigner for human rights and social justice. I'm well known as one of the Glasgow girls. The UBI is desirable to promote social justice and equality, and the SNP have long been supportive of universal basic income. The coronavirus pandemic has exposed the shortcomings of the UK social security system and has strengthened the call to further explore how universal basic income can be implemented. I'm actually reading this book and I disagree with Adi stating that it's not feasible. It definitely is feasible. But unfortunately, within the current system, we need further powers. I'll explain that in my further discussion. I also disagree. He said that in Finland, the report showed that it wasn't very successful. In the Finland report said that it helped with health and well-being of people and improved life. So just a disagreement there. A combination of factors has broadened the UBI appeal, rising inequality, and widespread economic insecurity, precarious work, and the potential of the labor to be displaced by technological change, including automation, which is expected on the labor markets, and artificial intelligence. The Tory UK government has eroded the social safety net over the last decade through brutal cuts and sanction and inhumane policies such as the benefit sanctions regime and benefit cap, the two-child limit, and rape clause, and the bedroom tax. I can go on, but there is many inequalities within their current social security system. And just to quote here, 200 million annually is being used for mandatory consideration just for appeals against ESA and PEP decisions. That's a lot of money that is being wasted, and the taxpayers' money for a system that does not work. I just want to say that this has not been implemented in countries, but there's been pilots run like in Finland and Canada and Netherlands. And I said that in Finland, there has been, the report says it has helped people's mental health and well-being, and people are less stressed. The present system of social security really is designed for, it's not designed for the modern economy. And the UBI is a solution to look forward to the future. I think there are a lot of other reasons for basic income, but perhaps one of the most fundamental one is will provide a degree of social resilience and security for household that is lacking in the present system. Over the last parliament, the SNP government has funded 4 local authorities to explore the feasibility of piloting the UBI. And we have funded 4 local council, Glasgow, 5, Edinburgh, and North Ayrshire, and partners like including Public Health Scotland is also being involved in the steering group. The basic income pilot is desirable, as I said. It's not feasible within the current devolved settlement, as necessary welfare and tax power remain with the UK government through the DWP and HMRC. I just want to say Aileen Campbell, our Cabinet Secretary, have written to the UK Minister urging them to engage constructively with the Scottish Government on this matter and discuss the next step towards the universal basic income pilot. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and final speaker before we go to the Q&A is Brian Smith, Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition. Brian.
Thanks, Mike, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. As socialists, we support any mitigations for what we see as the horrors that free market capitalism causes to workers across Scotland and indeed across the globe. We are fighting to change capitalism, overthrow it, but we fight for every reform that we possibly can on that journey. The drivers for UBI are clear as far as we're concerned, and some of the other candidates have outlined them there. Poverty levels, inequality levels that have went through the roof, all pre-pandemic, of course. Pandemic has just shone a light and exacerbated these things, as we all know. The scandal of insecure work and precarious work, particularly for young people, and the fact that they can't plan for their lives going forward in relation to secure income or housing. And we all know people in those situations. The mental health problems that are caused by the system that we currently live in are linked to the fact that there is billionaires and the world should be run for the billions, not the billionaires. That is what we say as socialists. But services have also been cut recently as well, which have left families under a burden that they wouldn't normally have. And I'd have to say a couple of speakers will probably need to look at themselves a bit, because they did oversee the austerity measures of the last 10 years that have led to a lot of the council services being actually cut. But we'll maybe come back to that. But that has left burdens on people, particularly women, in relation to care and responsibilities that used to be provided by local authorities or by voluntary sector organisations funded through councils. Another driver, or the final one I'd want to highlight, and I can say this because in my day job, I'm a trade union branch secretary, there's been an absence of decent leadership at times from the national trade unions and building an actual fight back against austerity and a fight back against poverty and inequality, because it's when workers are organised that we can actually take on some of the things in our society which are wrong and challenge the vested interest. And that's been a driver as well, I think, in relation to people looking for solutions and other ways to deal with the problems of the market. The UBI features which are positive, some people have described them already: the issue of social solidarity, the concepts of citizenship, universalism, which is socialist, we obviously agree with. The fact that it's not connected primarily to the labour market is something obviously which gives a degree of freedom to people. And fundamentally, that point about freedom is important, because I think the discussion about UBI locates freedom where it should be. It's predominantly about economics. It's predominantly about choice related to your income in the society we live in, and that's what creates freedom for people in a capitalist society, or doesn't create freedom for too many people in a capitalist society. And UBI, I think, takes head on some of those issues. The issue, of course, is the cash level that it be set at, and I know you all know that, and Bob and Mike have referred to that. The living wage in Scotland would be £18,000 a year if it was paid to everyone. So on that basis, is that the levels we're looking at? And I know that there's discussions about the benefit system in the back of that. But I would see it, and I'd finish on this point, I would see it as part of a wider battle against the free market system. Fight for jobs, fight for £12 an hour minimum wages, fight for taxing the rich, and crucially for public ownership. So hopefully it's part of a socialist struggle, is how I see the UBI. Sorry, Mike, about that. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you to all the speakers, most of whom managed to stay to 3 minutes. Got quite a few questions have come in already. In setting this up, we're very aware that an awful lot of the impact of levels of benefits of the pandemic and so on has fallen upon women. So we're particularly interested to hear from women in the audience. So please keep your questions coming in. We've had a number of statements, which aren't questions, so we won't be taking them. If you've got a question, keep it nice and we'll get it put. First up is John, who had a question for the panel. If you remember, unmute and got your video on. If you can find his unmute button. In fact, I think I can do it for you. There you go.
I was wondering if you had all signed our pledge, sort of offering, your support for UBI, and if so, why? And if not, why not?
Thank you. Okay, first round, we'll do it in the order. So starting off with Addy.
Thank you, Chair. I've not signed a pledge in support of UBI, and in my introduction, I did highlight a couple of reasons why. Just to go back to Rosa's point, she did quote something from the Finnish government. I think it's worth saying as well that the Finnish government did say that UBI actually did not help people into employment. That's the statement from the Finnish government. And they also said as well that they might consider other options, for example, what we're doing in the UK. So if UBI was that successful, they would not be considering other options. I'd just like to highlight that point. The key point for me, it's about, we're speaking about real people here, so I don't want to go into economics and numbers, because I think that's not going to be right. But we've heard, from several political parties speaking about, austerity. It'll be quite interesting to see what the SNP themselves have done on a local level at Glasgow City Council. So I'm a local councillor in Glasgow. And last year, Citizens Advice Services nearly got closed in Glasgow. And that's due to SNP's cuts to local authority budget. So I'm not exactly sure the SNP can, cover themselves in glory in that area themselves. They've had more funding from central government, but then they've cut local government budgets, basically because, people hardly take attention, to what's happening on a local level. And so we need to be very careful here, because people can make all sorts of political statements and be disingenuous as well. People aren't stupid. We've got to we can't replace a system with another system that's untested, unproven. There is no consensus in terms of the delivery mechanism for UBI. And if someone can show me right now, where the evidence is that this would actually take people into employment, this will break the cycle of poverty, I'm yet to see that evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol, any response to John's question? Sorry.
Well, in answer to the question, I have to confess, I haven't signed the pledge because I actually didn't know it was there. I have to say, as a candidate, I'm absolutely inundated by emails asking me to sign pledges, and I have been signing them as they have come up, and I have agreed with them. I will certainly sign a pledge to support UBI because I am totally in favour of it, but I wasn't aware that it was there. Can I just say a couple of things? First of all, I think that what we're here tonight is to discuss how this might be implemented. There has been a huge amount of consensus. I accept that not all parties are in favour of UBI, but there appears to be quite a strong consensus. And it seems to me there was a question that came up in the chat there, which basically sums this up. What we need to be talking about really are, if we're going to have a real serious look at this, what are the variables that we need to test out? What are the things that we need to find out about? And secondly, what are the criteria for success? Because we've already had a discussion about whether or not the Finnish model was successful, because basically, what were we looking for? And so those are for me, the two key things that any kind of pilot program needs to consider. How can this be done and the various ways we can do it? And secondly, what are we actually aiming to get out of it? Now, for me, what we're trying to get out of this fundamentally is that everybody, it's a human right not to have to struggle for the basics of life, and we shouldn't be in that position. In a previous incarnation, I was a secondary head teacher, and I have taught in many of the most disadvantaged areas right across the west of Scotland, from Clydebank to Coatbridge, and from the Gorbals to Hillhead, and I mean, you name it, and I have taught there, and I have seen the effects of poverty. And it's not right in this day and age that we have families that are struggling in the way that they still are. So to me, that's a fundamental right, and that's one of the criteria we need to look at. There are other criteria, and there are ways we can tackle this, and that's to me what this discussion should be about. How do we tease out all of these variables that we need to consider, and how do we measure success once we put a programme in place?
Thank you. Kim.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, John, for the question on the pledge. I'm pretty sure I have signed it, but I will go back and check, and I'll sign it again if I haven't. As Carol said, we do get hundreds of emails asking us to sign pledges, so I don't want to lie to you and say that I've definitely done something, but I will go back and do it. But as I said in my introduction, like, this has been a Green Party policy since day one of our party. I couldn't be more committed to this, so I'm delighted to sign it. Just on a couple of things that have been said there, I mean, yeah, I'm not quite clear, like, this is a kind of, is it a public meeting just on UBI? Is it a hustings? Like, I'm not quite clear what people are really wanting to get out of this, and that will determine that determines how we did our opening statements, it determines how we answer questions. So I'm very happy to talk about whatever the questions want to be, but yeah, I think there are different expectations, and that's where we've got to where we've got to. But yes, very happy to sign the pledge if I haven't done already. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Just to clarify, this is about universal basic income, so hustings particularly about that. Now, people have different reasons for supporting basic income. In Scotland, the idea of the feasibility study, the pilots, really came from the bottom up, from the people, including the poverty panel in Glasgow and similar assemblies in Fife, North Ayrshire and Edinburgh. So it was very much about alleviation of poverty. Elsewhere, people have looked at it in terms of impacts on the labour market and so forth. So I think the organisers of this evening really want us to focus on basic income and how it could alleviate poverty, in particular in Glasgow. Inevitably, that will touch on other areas, but if we could try and focus our answers, questions and discussion on that, that'd be most helpful. Pauline McNeill, please.
Thanks, Mike. And when that's, to me, it seems like a good opportunity, although it is an election, to have a serious dialogue about universal basic income. No, I haven't seen the pledge, but I wouldn't be signing it at the moment because it's something that Labour are looking at, and we're looking at it quite seriously and quite committed to looking at it. We will put in our manifesto support for minimum income for social security. So we do believe there should be a basic minimum income for every single person that relies on social security. I do think that there has to be something big that comes out of the pandemic crisis. And that's why I think it is a really serious discussion that we ought to have cross-party and with our citizens, because without public support, it would be difficult for any political party to implement it. And I think it would be useful to get into the nitty-gritty of it, because I sit in the Social Security Committee. We heard some evidence. Carol talked about the variables of such a scheme, and it is quite important to get into that, because would it mean more tax for other people? What would the minimum income actually be? I mean, these are the questions that do need to be answered. And that's why the pilots are important. A pilot must be credible. It must show that it's been run on the same basis that it might be if it was introduced as a policy. So if out of this pandemic, we don't get some serious policies and structural change to tackle poverty, then it has all been in vain, and we are certainly on board for that kind of level of change. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Rosa.
Hi, yes, I actually signed, it was my first pledge, and I sent an email to Bob, so I'm committed to the cause. And I think it would be a great idea to elevate from poverty. We see the current system is just not working, and we need to do something about it. And I believe the UBI will set an example. We see food bank rising, we see cuts from the Tories, a decade of cuts. And I would like to give an example to Adi. Also in India, there was a small basic income was paid to entire community as a pilot. And it showed that a huge uplift in economic activity of those people who received this. So that is one evidence that he might want to look into. I think I'm very supportive. I'm very vocal about UBI. And I truly believe the current universal credit is means tested, is based on behavior test, and it's just there's no dignity, and we really need to push for a better system. And hopefully the coronavirus have shown that the current system actually is not fit for purpose.
Thank you. Brian, finally, do you want to?
Thanks, mate. I mean, in terms of the pledge, I mean, the discussion here, I suppose, is part of what we're interested in. And if the pledge is around, you know, the principles of discussing it, the concept being supported as a principle, then you know, I think that's uncontroversial as a way of moving policy forward. But I think it's, and also running the pilots clearly, but I think it does still come back to the discussions about the level it would be set at, and what it would be about. And as you'd said there, Mike, if it's about alleviating poverty, what's the level then we're talking about here? It means that people wouldn't have to be relying on the insecure work that we've referred to previously. I realise that in some of the models, obviously housing and disability characteristics may be on top of a basic UBI, but it would still have to be set a lot higher than some of the figures that's been proposed at the minute, I would have thought, but I'm here to listen as well. But that would be my view, and the point I made about what the national living wage would be of £9.50 an hour takes you up to £18,000, and that's what we're saying a worker needs to live on. So in that sense, then that must be what we're aspiring to in terms of somebody's income expenditure on a yearly basis, if you're saying you want to keep them out of poverty and have a lifestyle. I think the point about the powers that Rosa made is right. It can't be delivered clearly with his current constitutional powers. I think the campaigners have obviously recognised that, and we're in favour of independent socialist Scotland. So in that sense, we would be, I agree with some of those points. But it's also a question about, will big business in an independent Scotland accept the level of taxation you would require in the current economic model? And it takes me back to that discussion about changing the model.
Okay, we're getting plenty of questions coming in. Thank you very much. To repeat what I said before, we're focusing on basic income. So if you can try and avoid addressing questions to one particular party, do it to the panel as a whole, because we'll get more out of it there. It'll tease out nuances and subtle differences between how basic income is considered by the different parties. And secondly, if we can stay away from the constitutional question, we know that's very important, but that will get us away from looking at basic income. If Ruth Wilkinson is there, could I ask you to put your question, please? Because it starts getting down to some of the nitty-gritty of what basic can do and maybe can't. Thanks, Ruth.
My question is, how would you approach UBI for disabled people whose living expenses could well be well above the average? Would there have to be some kind of means-tested top-up benefit system to a UBI?
Sorry, let's start with Carol.
I think actually that I've noticed in the chat there are quite a few questions coming up about the sort of level at which UBI would be set, and I think that's one of the things that needs to be piloted, because I think that actually that might be variable. If you look at some of our very rural communities, Orkney, Shetland, Western Isles and so on, the cost of living in places like that is actually significantly higher than it is in the Central Belt. So that's something that would need to be looked at. But in specific answer to your question, Ruth, I do actually think that there would still be extra payments for people. I think in any society we recognise that some people's costs are simply higher than others because of things like disability, either in themselves or members of their family or so on. And I don't think we can ever get away from the fact that society does need to give extra support to people, but it shouldn't be that that's what's required for the, for normal living with people who don't have these specific issues. That's where the basic income should be. But I cannot see that we would ever get away from the fact that there are some people that will always need extra support. And I don't think we should shrink from that. It needs to be done in such a way that it preserves people's dignity and nobody feels that they're, asking for handouts kind of thing, but that there are things that people will need extra money for, and I think we just accept that that's the case.
Thank you. Kim, anything to add?
Thanks. Yeah, so the feasibility study that was done identified that their recommendations would be that on top of a UBI, that there would be additional, so some benefits would be, UBI would be instead of some benefits, and it would be in addition to other benefits. So the model as proposed by the pilot, the feasibility study work, would include disability benefits would continue. There are additional barriers to disabled people because of the world that we live in is not disabled friendly, it is not accessible. And those are barriers that need to be removed, they need to be addressed. And also that means that there needs to be additional money to recognise the additional cost of living for disabled people. I would agree with Carol on the fact that there needs to be dignity in whatever approach. We need whatever social security things that we put in Scotland have to be about the principle of dignity for people. So that would be where we would hope to go with this.
Thank you. Pauline.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, obviously a flat rate basic income would have to have additional payment for those who may be worse off if we don't address the fact that they may have disability. So there would have to be an additional payment for disability, and I think it would have to be an additional recognition of housing costs being so variable. I mean, the current social security system already recognises that, so we can't have a flat rate for housing. So, I mean, that's why I think some detailed work really needs to go into addressing a principle of a flat rate, but you can't have people worse off, but there's no point in doing it. And then just lastly, just to add that obviously the administrative cost of running a social security system, which I think the Canadian model showed, although it was more expensive to run, that when you added in the cost of running a system, it reduced those additional costs quite substantially.
Thank you. And Rosa.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat it again, but yeah, I think under the UBI is you'll be paid extra money for disability. However, it will not be means tested. So it would be based on dignity and fairness. And I just want to kind of come back to what Brian said in relation to, I actually forgot his question, but I'll come back to it. It was in relation to the tax. And how to increase the taxation. Taxation needs to be increased to support UBI. However, there's been discussion, and I'm sure Brian will be also aware that reducing administration burden or bureaucracy, simplifying the kind of the government bureaucracy, can actually allow the taxes to be reduced. So there is that has been looked at as well, and hopefully that's a different kind of model that could be looked into.
Thank you. And we'll return to tax and affordability in a minute. And finally, Brian. Oh, it's not finally.
Yes, I mean, it would seem to me there would have to be additional payments for to recognise disability, but of course some of the barriers that people have identified there for disability could also be dealt with in other social ways, in terms of council services, universal services, free services, and crucially better employment practices. So again, really, sorry to go off topic again, Mike, sorry about that, but if you see UBI as part of an overall package of changes that has to happen, then I could see it being part of a better support system for people who have got disabilities, but with some of those other changes as well.
Thank you. And finally, Addy, if there was a UBI, would you envisage that there'll be additional support for disabled?
Yeah. Thanks for setting that trap. I think listening to some of the audience, the panelists, they kind of touched on some of my earlier points. There are key technical questions we've not really answered, and that's the difference in terms of living cost, in different areas of Scotland. Also, even Inclusion Scotland did say themselves that actually UBI could disadvantage people with disabilities. So I'm not saying that that's coming from Inclusion Scotland. I also think it's worth bearing in mind as well that the Scottish government information, there was an FOI to the Scottish government, which actually did say, the Scottish government in response did say that UBI could actually lead to deep cuts to public services. So we need to have serious conversations in terms of how this is going to be funded. Because the money is not going to come from, it would have to come from somewhere. And for me, I think we need to have that conversation.
Okay, I think that leads us neatly onto a question Bob Gillespie had about how would we pay for UBI? If you want to put that question, Bob. Need to unmute. On you go.
Thanks. I've typed it in. I'm just trying to find it.
Okay, if you want, the question was from where would the money come to pay for universal basic income, tax on the better off, increase in basic rate of income, tax, land and property tax, and so forth. Okay, missed your big opportunity. Right, if we start with Kim, how would you propose, given you're in favour of UBI, how would you propose funding it?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a broad consensus that the recovery that we need from the pandemic is an investment-led recovery. We certainly don't want to see further austerity. That would be tremendously harmful. So it's about what we invest in and how. I think that UBI and progressive, that we need progressive taxation, basically, that we would make no bones about it, but ask the rich to pay a bit more. Progressive forms of taxation is how you deliver lots. Introduction, yes, there's a cost to introducing a UBI, of course there is. So partly my answer to that is, well, what's the cost of poverty and who's bearing that cost at the moment? Some of this is about where we put the burden of paying for things, and at the moment it is on individuals, it's on families who are bearing the enormous stress and anxiety of trying to get through the day and put food on the table. So some of this is about recognizing where that cost exists. There is an existing burden there, and it's simply about putting that on a different place. Secondly, I think the benefits it would be in terms of virtually reducing poverty, and it's not just about poverty, but also all of the knock-on effects of that, in terms of people's mental health, in terms of people's physical health. We would need to try and define the amount of money that the health and social care services would save, because they're not having to deal with people who are just being pushed off a cliff. These are the things that we're having to use at the moment. Our current services are set up that we're just dealing with people in crisis all of the time, and that's a hugely, without being disrespectful to the individuals involved, but just on a kind of systemic level, that's a really inefficient way of working. We need to do things that actually stop people being pushed off the cliff in the first place. So for me, that's that investment is a no-brainer.
Thank you. Pauline, you said the Labour Party is investigating UBI. How would they propose to fund it?
Well, I think anyone who's been involved in the debate, and you probably know better than us, really, what the options are. I mean, there only are certain ways to fund it, is taxation and the existing funds to run social security and administration of. Interestingly, Reform Scotland they made a submission to the Social Security Committee in 2018. So there are quite old figures on what it would cost to scrap certain benefits. So they say that scrapping benefits be replaced by would receive about 3.6 billion in Scotland, and end of personal allowance would generate about 5.2 billion. So I won't go through all the figures, but clearly there's a shortfall. So which indicates that you would have to find the rest in taxation. And I suppose that's what I said in my opening statement, which is the biggest challenge, I think, for universal basic income, notwithstanding the system that you would have as public support for it. If we believe in it, if we believe there should be a fundamental change to provide basic support mechanisms for every citizen in Scotland, then we're going to have that conversation with people out there and ask people to pay more and to buy into the system. But I think the model, I think, is quite important, because I see that Rob Gibson had the question about, well, are we expecting everyone to work, or surely part of the system would be that people choose not to work? So there's another debate to be had about it, but yeah, so there's my answer.
Okay, thank you. Rosa, how would you see us funding UBI?
I mean, yeah, there's discussions about increasing tax, and we can achieve through that. However, there is, as I mentioned before, that there could be the removal of the current administration system, reducing administration burden and waste, and the universal benefit. The statistics shows it costs around 1% to outlay for the administration of UBI, where we have a means tested benefit. It costs an average of 3% to run. So therefore, it shows that cost is actually reduced by 2%. Also allows revenue to be redeployed elsewhere. So yeah, there's a big study on this, and of course redistribution of power at holes, and to reduce and eliminate poverty, and that is something, this is the way it should be done. So yeah, so personally, I think that if we remove the bureaucracy of administration and errors, and we pay so much money to companies like Maximus and Capita and Atos, and we pay so billions of pounds to these companies. We should be investing in a fairer and dignified system as the UBI.
Thank you. Brian, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, we could stop spending nuclear weapons is the one thing we could do, and that would free up lots of money. I mean, as socialists, we obviously are in favour of hammering the private wealth of the big businesses and the super rich. I mean, the 5 richest people in Scotland last year had a combined wealth of £12 billion. That's more than all the councils in Scotland spent on services from the Scottish Government. There's plenty of money, it's just in the wrong hands. One-off taxes for the super rich at a UK level, if we're talking about a UK as opposed to a Scottish level, a one-off wealth tax of 20% there would almost cover all the spending in COVID. So it's a myth that there's not enough money. There's plenty of money. It's just in the wrong hands. We would, in a Scottish Parliament elections, also increase the taxation powers and income tax. We would go for, if you're earning £90,000 a year, we'd want that to start playing at 90%, which is not that different from what Margaret Thatcher had when she came into power, to be honest with you. That's not as radical as it sounds, 90% on 90,000. So there's money there to pay for support, for benefits and for services. It's the political will to actually do what's necessary.
Okay, thank you. Addy, you don't support the introduction of UBI, but do you want to react to some of those other responses?
Yeah, but I think it's actually quite interesting hearing the comments. I see Pauline has skillfully avoided a couple of things. The Scottish government's own JES report shows that the income tax base in Scotland is actually shrinking. So the Scottish government were due to collect a certain amount of money, but it's shrinking right now. So if you're wanting to tax people more, can I just, kindly, softly suggest that perhaps you would not actually be able to collect that? I know we can shake our heads or disagree. That's not me saying, that's the Scottish government's own JES report saying the money basically isn't there to be taxed, essentially. So we need to have realistic conversations in terms of where the money is going to come from. And like I say, the Scottish government's own information, in response to a freedom of information request, on the 9th of July, just last year, basically said to fund UBI, you're basically looking at cuts to public services or increase taxation to every single tax bracket. So we need to ask ourselves questions as politicians, not just making broad statements. Who exactly is rich in Scotland? Is it the hardworking 35, maybe a senior nurse or lecturer who earns £35,000 a year? Are we going to tax that person more? Who exactly is going to be taxed, to pay for UBI? And I'm not sure if it was Pauline who raised the question as well. What's the expectation, once you've received UBI? Would you be expected to work? Would it be, it's a case of, getting paid by the government and there is no sort of expectation on you? These, to me, are much more pragmatic questions. I think we need to focus on the system we've got right now. And yes, we do have a lot of problems with what we have right now, but we can improve it, not replace it with a system that's untested, unproven, and there is no real, tested evidence that this is actually going to work. My final point, Chair, if you would indulge me, poverty is not just about money. I know people who have grown up in unbelievable levels of poverty, right? It's much more about, we turn this conversation into, give people money and that's going to solve all the problems. We have to think about what we do as a society, loneliness, in terms of community support, helping people to be aspirational, helping people to achieve their dreams. We need to look at ourselves seriously, as a society, and ask ourselves, do we have even a sense of community? And we've seen that during the pandemic with people coming to clap for NHS carers. These to me are much more, it's a complex situation. And I do not think UBI is actually the answer to what we have.
Okay, Thank you. And finally asking about affordability and such, Carol, please.
I think there's no doubt that initially, at least, this is going to be a costly exercise. And I think we have to just kind of bite the bullet on that. But I would characterize it as speculating to accumulate, because I think that the wasted human potential and the amount of money that we spend on support mechanisms for people in poverty and the toll that it takes on mental health and physical health, in the long run, this should actually cost us less. I saw somebody actually put in the chat, and I don't know where the figures came from, but they put in the chat that UBI, I think they're talking UK wide, would cost 67 billion, but the cost of poverty currently is 70 to 80 billion pounds in things like, social workers and care workers and unemployment and so on. And if I just give you one fact, poverty has a horrible impact on children's ability to benefit from the education system. And our prisons are actually full of people with very poor literacy rates. Leaving the education system with merely possibly functional literacy actually can stymie you for the rest of your life. And our prisons are disproportionately stocked with people in that position. And look at the cost of that, not just the human cost, but actually the monetary cost. So I accept that this is going to cost more money initially, but I would be very hopeful that actually in the long run, this is going to be the cheapest way forward, because once we've got more of society functioning properly and we can realize that human potential, that is going to be to the benefit of this country. So I think it's certainly money worth spending. And I think if this pandemic has taught us anything, it is that once we put our minds to something, we can do it. We were told we couldn't get a virus in less than 5 years, and now we're going to have something like 15 of them within a year because we put our money where our mouth was. And I think that's what we have to do in relation to poverty. We've been playing at it for too long, and we need to take a more structural approach, and we have to accept there will be an upfront cost, but in the long run, this will be to everybody's benefit.
Thank you. A question from Michelle Ferns, who I think is going under a different name. Is that correct?
Galaxy Tabby.
There you are. Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't know how to change the name on this. I'll need to wait till a young person comes in and ask for assistance. First of all, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Chair, for the invitation and giving me the chance to ask a question. Just a quick introduction is that my name is Michelle Ferns. I'm also a candidate on the Glasgow list standing for the Alba Party, and currently a councillor representing Shettleston Ward in the East End of Glasgow. A couple of people had mentioned that the Glasgow City Council had voted to endorse the proposal for a feasibility study. Just a wee couple of bits of information, I think, related to questions asked previously. My understanding is that the set level for that would be £223 a week, and that wouldn't passported benefits wouldn't be allowed to be counted, much like the system as it stands just now. So if you had PIP, if you're receiving DLA, attendance allowance and things, those under that feasibility study, those benefits wouldn't be allowed to be counted towards your £213. So I guess I want to kind of narrow, my question really kind of focuses on Glasgow. I know we've been talking kind of like in terms of a national, and we are in the middle of the election. I take your points well made, Chair, about not scoring political points. If we bring it back to Glasgow, as I said, I'm a councillor in the East End. Even before the pandemic, my casework was filled daily with casework about poor housing, insecure work, debt, people with disabilities, capability for work assessments. That has only blown up over the pandemic, and the casework is absolutely unbelievable. But in Glasgow, even though people have mentioned that the effects of poverty across everything, health outcomes, educational outcomes and stuff like that, but in Glasgow, we know we've got a specific and particular problem. We have, even where we have indexes where we have
question to the
panel.
panel.
I'll get there. Sorry, I'm taking the opportunity to talk because I was too late to join the panel. We know in terms of life expectancy and stuff that the poverty has a huge impact. In terms of the devolved government, the system that we're in now, because I believe that it's urgent, I'm pushing it now. What can we do within the system we're in now to put universal basic income into place? Sorry, you wanted a question, so.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And maybe if Alex Thorburn, could you add your question to that, please, because they go together.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's been clear to me that the debate on the introduction of UBI in Scotland is being won, but how do the parties think that they'll overcome what is obviously resistance from the DWP and HMRC?
Okay, thank you. Could we start with Pauline, please?
Thanks. Hi to Michelle, and I think it's a really good question. And as people like yourself, and you're talking about the work that you do in poverty, I think if more people had see what you see every day, I think maybe people could have more of a change of heart about what we need to do. So I think that what we do with the current powers is an interesting debate about what we do. So we can do two things under our current powers. We can create a new benefit, or we can have top-up benefits. So some debate as to whether the line is and what we can legally do. But Reform Scotland have actually suggested in one of their papers that you could create a top-up or a new benefit, which would be additional to what people already receive in the benefit system. I certainly think there's a consensus that we could creatively create a minimum income for those on universal credit and those on social security, which of course, I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone here that it's people who are in work who face the highest levels of poverty, and that's often missed. So I think we could work creatively. Obviously, there's lots of work to be done, and probably a different conversation about what we need to do in terms of meeting our targets in child poverty. But I do think, I suppose I'd finish in this, whatever we thought needed to be done before the pandemic, I do think it's going to have to be a complete revision. It will not do. The scale of it is going to be much bigger. So there's going to have to be much bigger thinking one way and the other, how we tackle it.
Thank you. Rosa.
Hi, yeah, Michelle, thanks for your question. Every day I work with constituents as well in a busy MP's office. So I deal with benefit issues and people disability benefits being taken off them, and you have to challenge DWP, and then they refuse the constituent, then you have to appeal to the tribunal and then win in the tribunal. It is a really exhausting process, and it's tiring, and you're fed up with the system. And to be honest with you, the report says that it's not feasible if it's not an independent Scotland. I'm sorry, I'm going back to the constitution issue, but this is the report stating that we need to have devolve powers as we have right now engaged with DWP and HMRC and the UK ministers to implement the next step for the UBI. So we'll see what we can do. However, the Scottish Government has actively engaged in supporting child poverty, making sure that children are supported because of the increase in child poverty. So the Scottish Child Payment have helped, will help as well, because it's now been doubled, hopefully soon, taking children out of poverty. And I think that's very important. And my question to Adi is, why did the Tory government during the coronavirus did not increase the child benefit? And I think that is for the Tories government to state, the Scottish government have taken steps to elevate children out of poverty. The Tories could have done the same in Westminster, but they chose not to do so. And this is what is sad. In Scotland, we are looking for improving people's lives, but with one hand behind our backs tied up, we can't really implement this. And that's kind of my answer to the question. Thanks.
Thank you. Brian, about powers and such.
I mean, in relation to Michelle's question, I suppose the answer to that is by having debates like this and having discussions like this is the answer to that, probably. In relation to Alex's question about how do you change the DWP and the HMRC's minds, I mean, yes, their minds will have to be changed, because if their minds weren't changed and they were implementing a UBI, I think we'd all be worried about it and what that actually would be, because they would be doing it from, you know, a right-wing point of view as opposed to a left-wing or more progressive point of view. So yes, their minds will clearly need to be changed, but that's a political fight. That's about us fighting the Tories, whether in Scotland or in England or in Wales. It's about working class communities getting together to fight the Tories, because they only respond to people organising against them. There's a role for the UK trade unions in that as well. So if UBI started to catch a mood at a UK level, regardless of the issues to do with the constitutional question in Scotland, how it would change their mind would be linking up with people in the rest of the UK to make the arguments and make the points, but crucially, to build action and campaigning on some of the ideas that people have raised here. It's about fighting the Tories. That's how you change the DWP's mind.
Well, Addy, how would you like to respond?
Thanks, Chair. I'll keep this short. Rosa made a comment about child payment being changed from £10 to £20. And interestingly, I actually had a conversation with someone yesterday on the child payment from the Scottish Government. And the person made a comment, I know people right now who still have not received their payment from the Scottish Government. But yet the Scottish Government is increasing a payment whose delivery mechanism is not even effective. I think the key, and I'm just going to say this here again, it's okay, you know, politicians make these broad statements, eye-catching rhetoric, but no one is actually looking at delivery. You know, no one is scrutinizing, you know, whether the delivery of these policies is actually reaching people on the ground. If you truly want to help people, take people out of poverty, focus on education. Now, I'm standing in Glasgow and East Land, and Drumchapel High, only 19% of the pupils in Drumchapel High leave secondary school with more than one higher. Now, I'm a lecturer. I can tell you right now, that would get them absolutely nowhere. If you want to tackle poverty, you focus on that.
Addy, I went to Drumchapel High and I went to university, so that shows.
You're an exception.
Carol, what would you like to add?
Well, in relation to the sort of two questions about putting UI in place now and then in the DWP and HMRC position, I mean, I would endorse what Pauline has said, is that the Scottish Government actually does have the power to top up benefits or create a new benefit. And while I accept that is not specifically UBI, that would be part, I'm presuming, of a pilot programme to actually see what impact does it have if you get people's incomes up to a level where additional benefits are not actually required, and at a level which allows them to live adequately in a technological society. And I would hope that if we can have successful pilots that actually give us the outcomes that we're looking for about improved health. I mean, the life expectancy in Chesilson is absolutely shocking, the worst in Europe. It take your breath away. But if we can show that there are impacts on health, impacts on mental health, impacts on schools and on children's education, then it's success that will move people, the HMRC or DWP. At the moment, there is a kind of, not a cultural divide, but there is a political divide in how people view poverty and how they view how that can be alleviated. But nothing succeeds like success. And if we run good pilots and show that it works, then it will be relatively easy to swing other politicians, other political groups behind it. Addy is pointing out it's the delivery that matters. And I actually agree with that. It is the delivery that matters. We got it all wrong with universal credit. We can't get it all wrong with this. So we have to pilot it, and we have to see that what we're suggesting is working and is having the impact that we hope it's going to have. I'm confident that it will. Just giving people more wherewithal to get on with their lives is going to have a positive impact. I'm firmly convinced of that, but we need to demonstrate that. And then I think you're going to get HMRC, DWP and anyone else thinking that this is the way to go.
Thank you. And Kim, respond to this particular question.
Thanks. Yeah, there's a lot there. First of all, I mean, I have to say it's difficult to imagine a scenario of how you convince the DWP or HMRC of anything, because you know things are pretty bad at the moment. So you might think if they could have been convinced, then that would have been there. I mean, I have to say the Scottish Greens will continue to you know, we're making a commitment to continue to negotiate for the powers to introduce a pilot. I would say to Abby and Addy, sorry, like fair play to you, because you're on your own and it's really hard to be the kind of lone voice on things. So you know, I take my hat off to you there, but I have to say, like, your argument about, you know, this hasn't been tested. Well, the reason it's not been tested is because the pilot has been blocked by the UK government. So like that, and it's also very difficult to, I totally understand, Chair, and we don't want to go down into constitutional rabbit holes here, but it's very difficult to talk about UBI in Scotland without talking about the fact that we really need the powers to enact it. However, it's not just, I mean, the UK government wouldn't have to fund it, they just need to agree to not claw back the kind of tax on top of things. So that there are routes there. We could also, and the Scottish Greens are interested in the feasibility of a Scottish minimum income, as I said in my opening remarks. So having a minimum income standard and then using the social security powers that Scotland does have to increase incomes of anyone living below this. Now, that is not a UBI. You know, a top-up is not a UBI, so I wouldn't be claiming that. However, the question was, what would you do within the current constraints? And that's something that we really need to look at. I think that the kind of wider question on I guess hearts and minds, if that's the question there. I mean, I am a bit concerned that there's been quite a lot of chat about, you know, does this incentivize people to work or not? And I think that's like, is that really the limit to which we need to be talking about people as human beings? You know, we're not just machines that are there to be working or not working. There is, yeah, and also, yes, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, so there's plenty of work going on at the moment, but it's not actually recognised because it doesn't count for GDP if you're doing unpaid care. So that kind of work is going on all of the time, and it's largely by women. It doesn't count as work by official statistics, but it's definitely going on. So a UBI would be a way to recognise that work. We still need to have better support for unpaid carers. As one, I couldn't be more in favour of this, but we also, you know, a UBI would be a step towards a greater recognition of that unpaid caring work that it's largely women that are doing.
Thank you. As we expected, we're going to run out of time, getting so many good questions and comments. Just to clarify, what the feasibility study was proposing was actually 2 levels would be of UBI be paid in Scotland in the pilot areas. One that would be replacing the existing means tested benefits at the same rate to see what behavioural changes there might be amongst people if they no longer had to make themselves available to work, the threat of sanctions was taken away, and so on. And then at a higher level, at that minimum income standard, to see how lives were changed by removing the threat of poverty, by increasing incomes to that sort of level, the officially recognised minimum income standard. I put a link in the chat to basicincome.scot, which is where the feasibility study is. There is a huge amount of material there, very rigorous and robust economic modelling of the impacts as well. So it would answer some of the questions people have put in there. There's a number of questions come through about who would qualify. Would it be age related? Would the under 16s, under 18s be entitled to basic income? And from Hayden, a question about refugees and asylum seekers. So if I could ask on those participants' behalf of each of you, so who would you see a universal basic income, either at the pilot stage or later, in a full-blown basic income study in Scotland? Who should be eligible? Should it be individuals or households? Should it be everybody who lives in Scotland, including asylum seekers, refugees, or just citizens, and so forth? So let's go to Rosa first.
Sorry, I was busy writing some statistics in the chat. Sorry, was that a question in relation to asylum seekers not having access to public funds? Was that the question?
Would you support, or would you see a basic income experiment being for everybody regardless of age, or would there be a minimum age? And would it also apply to refugees, asylum seekers, or just to citizens of Scotland?
Well, you say universal basic income, so it is universal, and it should be for everybody, no matter where you come from and what is your status and how old you are. So it should not be based on those criteria. So it should be universal for everybody, and it should be also, I think, the universal basic income argues, and I think that's why it's so popular within the political sphere nowadays, is that everybody, even the rich people, will be receiving universal basic income, and it's showing social solidarity between all classes, not just for the poor. Yeah, that's my answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Brian.
Yeah, I mean, it should be universal. I think there's then the issue about, you know, the additional characteristics we were talking about previously there, which obviously have been top of that. I suppose the issue about children, but my thinking probably in that is that children would have to be paid it, but it would be paid to one of the parents. I would probably favour in a default position to the mother. I think one of the progressive things about child benefit system in the UK for decades was that payment that was made to mothers mostly, and around. I realise that family dynamics have changed, but you get the concept that I'm making there because of the points we've made about gender and sex discrimination within society, and the position of women in relation to the gender pay gap and stuff like that. Yes, asylum seekers and refugees should be paid the same and have the same rights as other citizens in Scotland, of course, and the entitlement to the same standard of living, good or bad, is something that should be afforded to everyone, regardless of what your status happens to be. A loaf of bread's the same for somebody as a loaf of bread's the same for somebody. So it's the same issue.
Thank you. Addy, if there was a basic income, would you see it being for everybody who lives in Scotland?
Well, you know, I don't support the policy, so I'll be quite brief here as well. I think what I'm taking from what I've heard tonight in response to your question is that people haven't really thought about the operational implications of what you're saying. So, a speaker has said universal basic income should be paid to every single person, regardless of age. That in itself, can I just suggest, it's not possible. You know, just even from an economic perspective, you simply can't pay every single person regardless of age. If you're going to do that, then you would seriously then have to mince the state, which means we're basically reverting back to what we have right now. So would you pay a 1-year-old? At what stage do you qualify for a UBI? And who would be in receipt of the UBI payment as well? Also, how are we going to actually monitor these? So for me, the answers tonight, I'm leaving with more questions than answers, and I think I'm just going to leave it there.
Thank you. Carol.
I think the question here is actually really quite fundamental, and it's one of the things that needs to be tested out. I noticed right at the start that when Mike was talking about this conference that's coming to Glasgow, it's a basic income conference. It isn't a universal basic income. And I think that's because, what do we mean by universal? That's one of the things we need to test out, because you can think of it as being, as some people have suggested, absolutely everybody in the country gets given that income. And then those that are earning more, it would be taxed back from them, basically. That's one way to think of it. Another way to think of it is that there's a basic income level below which people shouldn't drop, that's the universal basic income, that we should all be above that level, and we should have a system that ensures that happens. I saw in the chat, somebody said, we shouldn't be talking about universal basic income, we should be talking about a negative income tax. Now, to me, that's just another delivery mechanism. It's saying that we're all in the taxation system, and when your income is above a certain level, you're actually paying into the tax system, and when it's below, the tax system is coming out. It's like, you know, a permanent kind of tax refunding system. But these, to me, are all about the technicalities of the delivery of this, and that's what we need to test out. I don't think we've got the answers to that as we sit here. That's what we're discussing, and that's actually what we need to pilot. If you asked me off the top of my head, without researching and doing this piloting, who should get it, I think I would say we're looking at adults. So I would be saying it would be people over the age of 18. Now, that's partly because I'm so old that I think of a 16-year-old as pretty much a child. The idea that a 16-year-old is kind of out on their own and having to make their own way in the world actually slightly horrifies me. But I do know that there are children in that position, and that's something that the state needs to cater for. But I would be thinking of people, adults, who normally would be responsible for themselves, and that's what the state should be making sure. But as I say, that's off the top of my head. I think what we're talking about here is, what are all the issues we need to investigate and we need to pilot to get to the correct decision, not bungle this and then have to change it all the way that you bungle it in the way that universal credit was bungled. But that would, if looking at it just briefly, I would say every adult should be eligible for this. But how we go about it is what we need to test out and discuss.
Okay, thank you. Kim, any
Thanks.
difference?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, the pilot, the feasibility study, the final report of that is a really substantial document. I think it's like 160 pages long. There is a huge amount of detail in there, and it confirms the proposed model for a pilot going ahead. And that includes, as you said already, Mike, the two different levels of income, and it also has a proposal for the different payment brackets that would be according to age and who would get it for children and young people. And so, like, that isn't something that still needs to be worked out. There is a proposal there. It's been thought through. There's been an awful lot of work over the past 4 years, and there is a proposed model there. So I do take a bit of objection to the idea that we're starting from scratch on this, because we're really not. Universalism is a really good policy. It's how you remove stigma from things. It's things like free school meals for all Scottish primary children that the Scottish Greens have just done. Like, that's what we need to be doing, because that is how you remove stigma from things, and it's how you make sure that everybody gets access to things. In terms of individuals versus households, it's really important that it would be a payment to individuals. We know that people who are, and I saw a question earlier in the chat, that people who are living with domestic abuse, one of the ways that can be perpetrated is through financial control. So it's really important that payments would be to individuals. And I know that Engender and other organisations have campaigned on that and come out really strongly on that. So that is a really important principle that we would want to hold to. And that is what is proposed in the pilot proposal by the feasibility study. And finally, I just want to talk about in terms of immigration. So, like, the people who have no recourse to public funds, this is something that I'm really, really concerned about. So I've done a lot of work over the past 4 years as a councillor on asylum justice. So Glasgow, as you'll know, is a dispersal city for people seeking asylum protection. So people are deposited in Glasgow, you know, as a strange city with the trauma that they've carried, with the horrific journey that they've been on. They are either given a tiny amount of money, or they're not entitled to public funds at all, and they're not entitled to work, of course. So that is the UK government deliberately, like, putting people into poverty and condemning them to poverty indefinitely, because we know that the asylum system takes an awful long time to get through, and there's all sorts of appeals, and it's just horrendous. And people are then, if they are then given a refusal, and they're still eligible to appeal, but they've got no recourse to public funds, so they're not allowed to work, and they also cannot access mainstream support systems like the mainstream homelessness system or the mainstream benefits. And you are deliberately, the UK government deliberately puts people into destitution. It's one of the most shameful things that this country has done. And in Glasgow, this is a huge, huge issue. And it's people who are living just, next door to you in your tenement. We are about to hear, I think we're going to see an explosion of human rights breaches with the impact of Brexit legislation, because we're going to have a whole new group of people that are suddenly going to be no recourse to public funds because of the immigration law changes that are about to have an impact there. So there'll be a whole new group of people who find themselves suddenly stripped of those rights to housing and to work and to certain kinds of social care support as well. So this is going to hit our city really, really hard, and I'm incredibly concerned about it. It's also worth saying that this costs us as a city. So like putting to one side the kind of horrific humanitarian impact that this policy has, it also costs the city an awful lot of money, because by the time that people can get are eligible for support is when they are like in absolute crisis in terms of their health or their mental health. So that's the point at which they can be supported. And obviously it costs a lot of resources to try and support someone where at that really crisis point, but they've been pushed to that crisis point.
Okay.
So yeah, so yes, we need to look at that really seriously as well.
Okay, and Pauline, finally, on who should be eligible for BI.
So I mean, the model of universal basic income, I mean, to me is the all important thing. And I mean, I did a bit of reading, I'm sure everybody else. I have to be honest and say that's one of the things I'd like to discuss further, because I find it a little bit confusing. Some models talk about adults and children, other models talk about not everyone would pay. So I think unless there's a general agreement on the model, it's kind of hard to get everybody on board for this. But for me, I mean, what's its purpose? Its purpose is to eliminate poverty and to be fair to every single citizen that lives within our country. So that has to be the primary purpose. I mean, for me, the context has to be the pandemic. And I just want to put this into context because we are a long way at the moment from a universal basic income. Why? Because the isolation grants for poorer people who have to be isolated are not universal. Business support has not been universal. I mean, I know lots of businesses haven't had a single penny of help. It's not universal help. Many people, students get no help from Social Security. So there's so many holes and gaps in our current system, and the pandemic has exposed it. And I think it's really important when we, whatever the outcome of May the 6th election is, all of us need to impinge upon the new governments and new politicians that people who are impacted by the pandemic didn't cause their own situation to happen. Decisions were made, albeit on grounds of public health, that people had to stop their work and stop their businesses. And therefore, that's why I do think a big idea, a radical idea, is something that there's going to have to be a consensus on, whether it's this one or something akin to that. So lastly, yeah, I mean, I think many of the refugees, and it's an issue which is really close to my heart, have come here, didn't come from poverty. Many of them came from wealthy situations and businesses and jobs, but because of conflict, they've ended up in countries like Scotland and Europe. So, and given half a chance to live in dignity, they would contribute hugely to the country. So I think the all important thing, Mike, is I think there's going to have to be some consensus somewhere in the middle, or I don't really see us moving forward. And I would like to see us move forward in something like this.
Okay, thank you. We'll make this the final question. You've got about a minute each, and I'll pull together a whole series of themes that have been in the chat. People are saying, but surely basic income could be helpful for those who want to be self-employed, thinking of setting up a business, do more training and so forth. And for the reasons that in particular Pauline's just given, the pandemic, which left so many gaps, isn't basic income an efficient, effective way to do it? And we could maybe get rid of a lot of the other schemes, small, very expensive and so on, and go for a basic income which would allow people to make better life choices. Brian, let's start with you.
Thanks, Mick. Yeah, I mean, the support for self-employed, Pauline's right, actually during the pandemic has been one of the scandals. And of course, the vast majority of self-employed people just really look like workers now. You know what I mean? It's the days of the self-employed being out with the experience of working class people is well gone. You know, so, you know, as a socialist, I don't want to nationalise the chippies. Do you know what I mean? Just to make sure that nobody's under any illusion about that. But so anything which supports people to get an economic life, that's okay with us within the parameters that we would see of a market economy in that sense. I think the issue about the means testing going, I think that's right. It's wrong for all number of reasons, which everybody in this call will know. So any move to universalism, and I suppose if there's one principle that maybe comes out of the night, not to try and get an outbreak of consensus, because I wouldn't usually do that as a socialist, but the consensus about universalism that was raised there, I think that's right in that sense. I realise that Adi won't agree with that, but that idea of there's going to be universalism as opposed to means testing and scapegoating people is something that certainly I think people could build on.
Thank you. Adi, how would you? Do you see a role for basic income supporting volunteering, self-employment, enterprise?
I think it's worth saying a couple of things. So during the pandemic itself, we've seen unprecedented levels of support from the UK government, and I think we should acknowledge that. In terms of business loans, even the furlough scheme at the height of the pandemic, 80% salary, people being paid that. And that's huge. I can't think of any other country in the whole world that has had a successful rollout of support compared to what the UK Chancellor has achieved. So Rishi Sunak has been absolutely fantastic. And I think we should acknowledge that. I do take the point that we've had gaps in the system. And that's why I think the Chancellor has put in a couple of measures to help the self-employed. Actually, people make the self-employed gap in terms of support. It's actually much more technical. It's about how businesses are set up, but I don't want to go into that. I think the key thing for me is we can't have universality in terms of it's still any support needs to be means tested, and what we need to focus on is improving what we have right now. Otherwise, we would end up with people who don't need the money getting the money. So there is no point. And even from an economic perspective, you could actually drive up inflation. Someone would say, well, we've not had inflation since during the pandemic. Well, so much money has been going into people's pocket for those who have been opportune enough to keep their jobs. But people have not had the opportunity to spend that money into the economy. What the UK Chancellor has to do is to determine the right level of money to put into the economy without increasing inflation as well. But that's a different argument for another day. So I don't support this idea of universality.
Thank you. Carol, 1 minute, please.
Well, I believe you only get one life. I don't believe in reincarnation. And it really upsets me that some people's lives are so arid and so difficult compared to others. And that's what we need to address. The issue of child poverty particularly is disgraceful. And it affects their health. We know that. It affects their mental health. It affects their education. But fundamentally, it affects their confidence, their security, and it holds them back. It diminishes aspiration. Now, when I used to take a first-year class and I'd never met them, and I would ask them, write down what you want to do in life. If I was in the leafy suburbs, I got back bits of paper covered in lawyer, doctor, accountant, and so on. If I was teaching I never actually taught in Drumchapel, but I taught in a lot of places the equivalent of Drumchapel, and some kids didn't know what to write down. They'd never thought of what job they would do, and they certainly weren't writing down middle-class professions. It fundamentally affects aspiration, nothing to do with ability, but aspiration and the way that you think about yourself. We have to do something radical. I totally agree with Pauline. We have a system that's full of holes, that diminishes people's dignity. We need a radical change of tack. And I believe that a universal basic income is one that we can take to try and solve a lot of these problems.
Thank you. Kim, 1 minute, please.
Thanks. Yes, absolutely. Universal basic income would be a way to encourage volunteering. It would be a way to reward care work, unpaid care, as I said earlier, to recognise that that is work. Just because it's not counted as part of GDP, it's absolutely work, and we're doing it. It would be a way to remove the precarity that is very much part of life for self-employed people, having been there myself. So much of my energy I had to spend on trying to work out how I was going to get contracts for the next, the next few months, and that really removed my ability to obviously focus on what I was trying to do at the moment. So it's about removing precarity, and that's about people of my age as well, who are, people who are working 0 hours contracts, people who are stuck in rubbish jobs with terms and conditions that they're not happy with. So yeah, there's a lot there. But also I think this is about removing barriers for people. Like at the moment, we have this idea that the people who achieve the most in the UK are from a very, very small demographic group. And do we really think that they're the most talented group of people? No, of course not. But they've just got the fewest barriers. So universal basic income has a policy of universalism, and that is how we encourage everybody to be able to flourish and to be able to develop their creativity, their talents, go back to studying, or try something new, take risks. That's how we do it.
Thanks very much. Pauline.
Interestingly, a lot of people supported the Irish model, which was give everyone £2,500 during the pandemic as opposed to the furloughs. I thought it was interesting that a lot of people supported that idea. I agree with Andy. I think that the UK government did the right thing on furlough, but I want to make one important point. Germany and France did it, but when they first did it, they did it much longer term. Lots of people lost out, fell through those gaps because of the piecemeal way it was done. And lots of people have fallen through the cracks. These are people who had good jobs before. So when we talk about what we're going to do about poverty, I think it's important to remember lots of people will find themselves in a hardship position because of the pandemic they previously didn't. So I think it's really important to address that question. The current system of universal credit is actually causing poverty itself because of the way in which it's structured, the 4-week wait, and the fact that it doesn't match your pay. If you finish one job and you get your holiday pay, you get nothing for 6 weeks. The system itself, as it is designed, and you could make changes, is causing quite serious poverty. So I finish on this point. We need to do something radical. I absolutely believe in this because of what I've been saying tonight. Well, we need to get public support. If it involves further taxation or any changes, we need to get people talking about this and get them to buy into the idea, because if we don't, we are talking to ourselves and nothing's going to happen. But I would like to see change.
Thank you very much. And finally, Rosa.
Yeah. So yeah, it says that we secure it sets a security safety net, and someone like setting up a new business, they would know they would have an income to fall back on. So it really it shows that it supports creativity of people, and people will be supported and they're not scared that they will fail in that setting up that business. So being more self-sufficient, having more time to do creative work. I mean, we have to look into the beverage the social security system, or the current benefit system that was set up. It was set up in a system based on a national insurance and a national assistance. However, Beveridge thought that the means tested bid will eventually die out. In fact, what has gone wrong is that the social security system since the war is exactly has reverse of that. We have great expansion in means testing and cruelty, and billions of money is being spent on companies like Capita and Maximums. So we really need to think and see that we actually not, the current system is not working, and there is a need for change. So that's why I believe that we really need to look into the UBI and implement this idea so we can bring positive change to people's life. Universally, we have a duty and the United Nations has said to the Tory government that the current system is punitive and it punishes people really with the current system. So you see there's a need for change, and Adi can say all these great things has happened with the Tories and so on, but we know the reality. We know what's happening with people. Self-employed people had to struggle for many months for political parties to push the Tory government to receive this money. The money was not given to us, was by politician being active, and that was then given to the public.
Thank you very much. Okay, if I can draw the hustings event to a close, thank you very much, particularly to the candidates. That's 2 hours you've sat listening to questions, answering them, in many cases off the top of your heads, not making up party policy as you go, but really demonstrating how competent and well informed any candidates to a parliament must be. And I think people often forget the huge amount of effort that you all put in. I think the key words we've heard just in the last part there were about aspiration, about removing barriers, about promoting and finding better ways to alleviate poverty, to rid us of the precariat of poverty and such. Just one final point on universalism. At the BN Congress in August, there will be an agreement signed between the Basic Income Earth Network globally and the United Nations Development Programme to explore generally a universal basic income so that everybody in the world would have a basic income. And given that most people in the world are existing on just over $1 a day, that is perfectly feasible policy to pursue. So I'm going to thank all the participants, thank you all for the questions, particularly the candidates, and I'll now hand back to Susa, who will finish the whole event for us. Thank you very much. You're on mute, Susa.
Thank you very much, Mike, for hosting this and chairing the event. Thank you to all the candidates. I can see you all believe passionately in what you're saying. And thank you to everyone organising. Great team we've had there as well, and to everybody for attending. One of the things I would suggest people do if they can is save or download the chat from this event. Or if you can't do that, do what I do, which is copy and paste it, because I seem not to be able to download it. There's lots of useful information in there, and there's also the contact information for both the Glasgow UBI Conversation Group and the Glasgow Commonweal Group from which we grew out of. So you can reach us on Twitter, Facebook, and by email. So I'd just like to remind people of the pledge that has been printed around by BIN Scotland and UBI Labs Network, and we're asking all candidates to sign that if they agree to promote basic income or promote a trial of basic income. There's also a pledge for activists to sign as well that are not actual candidates, to pledge they will support and take action going forward. I don't know if while I'm speaking someone could perhaps pop the link to that into the chat. Going forward as well, BIN Scotland have released a UBI conversation toolkit, and the Glasgow UBI conversation are very, very aware of this and conscious that not everyone is able to access online events such as this, perhaps because of ability, language, the time of day, all sorts of things. So we will be using the BIN's toolkit going forward to try and engage more people in Scotland and in our communities in Glasgow in the UBI conversation. If you want to become part of the Glasgow UBI conversation, we call ourselves GUBIC as an acronym. You can email on either the UBI conversation email address or on the Glasgow Commonweal email address, or DM or PM us on the social media sites. I just want to remind you that we are a discussion group, so that means that we're open to all people's, beliefs and all people's points of view on this. We have been messaged directly during setting this group up and setting up this event from people who have contrary opinions on how we go about making things better. So people who have MMT, modern monetary theory, offering to give us kind of their take on things. So going forward, the group will meet regularly, ostensibly to promote UBI, but also to, invite these people to come along and tell us their take on it, and so we can all become more informed about that. And also there's a couple of political parties, smaller parties or newly formed people who didn't make it onto the panel because the party was either formed too late or one of the parties didn't respond to our email, but I think there's a representative in the audience tonight, so that's 2 parties that can get in touch with us if they wish to. I think that's about it really. Thanks very much, and let's keep the conversation going. It's a great thing that we've got the Congress coming up this summer in Glasgow, and we'd love to do something, COVID permitting or something permitting, to raise our kind of place in social media and get Glasgow talking about this. So thank you all very much. I will send a follow-up email with some of the stuff in it for everybody who registered, and thanks, and good luck in the elections, everyone.
Indeed. Yep. Thank you all very much.
Thanks. Good night.
Bye-bye, everybody.